Well, a very warm welcome to everybody joining our webinar, our NSF webinar today on tackling drug shortages. My name's John Johnson, and I want to extend that warm welcome to delegates who have registered for this webinar from over 25 different countries. As expected, we tend to get a lot of people from UK, USA, India, and Europe, but there's some notable additions this particular webinar from Peru, Mexico, and Colombia, who make up 10% of our registered delegates. So a very warm welcome. I'm going to explain something about the causes, the trends, and the effects of drug shortages around the world just now, trying to help you understand what's happening out there and how the regulators are seeing it themselves. And ultimately, how is this going to affect the way that you interact with your regulators during GMP inspection? And I know this subject is going to be very close to many of your hearts because many of you are quality directors or EU qualified persons, and you really want to know how your next inspection may pan out given these particular trends. So let's just dive straight into it. So many of you already know me. I'm John Johnson. I'm VP for NSF Health Sciences. And one of the aspects of my career that's has been a continuing theme really is the responsibilities for releasing safe and efficacious products onto the market as a quality director and also as a VP. Specifically, I think my expertise is in transformational projects, culture change, GMP remediation projects, especially in sterile production and bioprocessing. And for those of you that are really interested in this subject, I'd also refer you to the interview that I did with Rizwan Chowdhury last week. And as you can see, I've given you the link below to that interview. So hopefully that's of interest too. So what am I going to talk about? Well, first of all, are drug shortages an issue? And I think the answer there is definitively yes, they are. Most certainly they are. What is causing drug shortages? Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. And do we think our regulatory agencies around the world are going to change the way they interact with us, the way they inspect our facilities? And the answer to that, very much so, is yes, and in a number of different ways. So let's just backtrack a minute and just remind ourselves about the importance of drug shortages, because this picture of my granddaughter Matilda, means a lot to me, because in this particular webinar, it reminds us of the human element that is always linked to supply chain issues. We have to make sure that people in need of treatment get the treatment they need, when they need it, how they need it, and with the optimal primary therapies. And there seems to be a huge and quite embarrassing prevalence of postponements, alternative therapies and alternative treatments that are being made just now because of drug shortages. And we must never forget how this affects patients across the world, old and young. So let's look at some examples of the drug shortages out there. So back in 2019, so pre-COVID, so this has nothing to do with the COVID pandemic, look at the numbers of drug types that experienced significant drug shortages in the last year. A wide variety of different products that had shortages. Some of these patients are going to be heavily dependent on, and those shortages seem to be carrying on into 2020 and possibly even beyond. Amazingly, during June to August last year, nearly a fifth or just over a fifth of all prescription drugs were in short supply in the UK, which puts considerable strain on the health service and all of the health service providers. And ultimately, when a survey was done of the Pharmacist Defence Association in the UK, more than 90% of respondents thought that this situation was only going to get worse. So a pretty significant issue just here. If we look at the USA, I think this is an amazing statistic. This is from the FDA report on drug shortages, that 56% of US healthcare providers had to change patient care or develop different strategies in light of drug shortages in 2018. It seems to be getting worse, And some of those shortages can last as much as 8 years. Can you just get your head around an 8-year drug shortage? So needless to say, since 2018, the FDA have made drug shortages a #1 priority for the agency and have set up a number of different schemes and programs to try and alleviate this serious situation. So what types of products are affected? And I think this was useful because it may give us some clues as to where the issues are actually occurring and why, and how we might do something about it. So you may be interested to know that 63% of product shortages are steriles. So these tend to be the more high risk, maybe the more complex formulations, and well over half of the drug shortages are to do with sterile formulations, which I think is a real concern. 67% of shortages are generics, so Me Too products. Is that telling us something? And look at this, the median time since the original approval is 35 years. So these are real legacy products. So these are sterile, generic, legacy products. Essentially, they are the low margin, legacy, high volume, high dependency generics that health services across the world really depend upon. So these are the areas that are giving the most pain, the most heartburn to pharmaceutical companies and regulators around the world. So given this fact, what caused these types of shortages, and what made these sort of products vulnerable to outage across the world? Well, the FDA have done a very good report on this, and they identified 3 main root causes for this concern. The first one is that margins are being driven down by the purchasers. So fundamentally, there's no incentive to manufacture the products of low margin, and that can make things incredibly difficult. If there's no margin to manufacture that product, there's no incentive to actually manufacture the products at all. And even if that capability is in-house, there's no funds available to invest in the facilities, invest in people, or invest in the quality systems. Of course, we have to think very hard about the second root cause as well, that fundamentally there's little reward for manufacturers with mature quality management systems. So if you're a high-performing company, you don't necessarily receive the most purchase orders. Conversely, those companies that carry risk, that maybe are considered to be higher risk of product shortages, don't receive any penalties from the purchasers. So there has to be some sort of reward and risk in order to reward and punishment, or reward and action, in order to actually incentivize people to do the right thing. The other key root cause that the FDA identified was that in many cases across the world now, supply chains are fragmented. They've been split up into different locations, different time zones, different cultures, different types of quality systems. And whoever is the marketing authorization holder or the license holder can find it very difficult to manage such a diverse and diffuse supply chain. And ultimately, when that supply chain is disrupted, it can be very difficult to restart. So let's have a look at these root causes. Of course, over the last 10 to 20 years or so, there's been a huge drive to global supply chains for 2 main reasons. One, of course, is cost management. And we ought not be too critical of that reason, because ultimately one of our jobs in the industry is to provide our pharmaceutical products to as wide a group of people, a wider population of people that we possibly can, at a cost that they can actually stand. So it is important that we work out all of the forms of waste, all of the ways of saving money, and do a proper risk assessment when setting our strategies. So it is a commercial business, but we don't necessarily always use the best risk assessment tools to decide where to put our particular supply chain. The other key reason, of course, is that over the years, as products have become more complex, certainly those that have recently come off license, we've decided that we would like to place certain parts of the process in so-called centers of excellence. So making sure that you're putting your particular specialist process in a facility that is used to operating that particular types of process. So that has led to a real fragmentation of the supply chain. I'm going to hit you with quite a lot of data and statistics really in this webinar. This one again, I think really jumped out of the page when I saw this, that now in 2020 in the USA, only 12% of the APIs used in the USA originate and are manufactured in the USA, as opposed to 37% of the formulations. So USA, in common with many countries in the rest of the world, really have a high dependency on global supply chains. So this isn't going away, but certainly we need to manage it a lot better. The problem with this, of course, is those global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption for a variety of reasons that we're going to go into. When they are disrupted, when part of that chain stops or is constricted or has an outage, it can be very difficult, both from a regulatory point of view and also a commercial point of view, to get them restarted. So restarting can be very expensive, it can be a big distraction, it can lead to drug shortages in all of your licensed markets. The other issue here that they talk about in the FDA task force report is that fundamentally, because we've found cheaper ways of doing things using a global supply chain, there are very few incentives to bring back manufacturing to maybe some of the more established parts of the world. And when you look at the available capacity in those locations, because of the global supply chain trend, many of those plants in those local areas have been closed and are just not there anymore. So there is a real difficulty that when a purchaser is thinking about placing a supply chain, is there available capacity? Is there enough choice? Are there enough locations around the world? Is there enough diversity in the maturity of the quality systems in order to help them make an effective selection? So we have to be aware that these supply chains are vulnerable, they're difficult to manage, and that fundamentally you may not have as much choice these days as to where to place your supply chain, given the lack of capacity in some key parts of the world. So what other reasons are there out there for potential drug shortages? First of all, of course, and you've heard me say this a number of times on my webinars, is that we really struggle in this industry to do proactive quality risk management. You know, we find it very difficult to preempt some of the crises and difficulties that we may face. We also really have an issue sometimes where when we set up supplier agreements and we begin a new relationship with the supplier, that relationship can be rather transactional, it can be cost orientated, and it can lead to a very superficial relationship. And that obviously always makes ongoing oversight of that supply chain very difficult, because of course both sides only tell each other the barest minimum, they only share with each other the barest minimum risks, and everything is based upon purchase order and supply rather than building a deep relationship. There is also a real lack of appetite to reward or penalize suppliers. What I mean by this is, of course, it makes perfect sense if you have a good supplier that you would go from approved to preferred to certified and minimize or reduce the amount of testing and oversight required. But when that supplier fails to perform to the standards you expect, are we so good at going back from certified, preferred to approved, or even to disapproved? So there has to be much more of an incentive to change suppliers when they're not performing. Of course, what we see from our research and from what we see from the regulatory agencies, many of the parts of the supply chain around the world are legacy facilities, not necessarily built to the 2020 design attributes that we expect these days, not necessarily operating their quality management system to the most mature and resilient standards. And of course, ultimately, there's always the aspect of culture and leadership styles that can be difficult to manage when you have 3, 4, 5, even up to 10 different stages in different locations around the world. So when you look at the site inspection scores from the FDA, from their fiscal report 2019, you can see that there's some parts of the world that are not achieving the level of GMP uniformly across the world. All of these survey scores were acceptable by the FDA, but you can see that there's still parts of the world that are not at the standards expected. Now that margin is narrowing. They're certainly getting better, but it's taking some time, and there's some rocks in the road. We're quite sure of that. The other thing that's interesting with this is that over the last 2 years, there's been almost a doubling of warning letters from the FDA, of which 70% of those warning letters were for new site applications. So this means new suppliers to the US or a new supplier to the marketing authorization holder or license holder. Probably most often a new supplier to the supply chain. So we have to do something to help these new suppliers become the best version of themselves. Ultimately, of course, if your site inspection score is unacceptable and the GMP observations that are identified during audit are critical or systemic or major or recurring, there's going to be a high probability that regulatory action may be needed. And that can often lead to a remediation program, an interruption to routine supply, or even market action and recall. And from our research, just in terms of unbudgeted spend, that type of market action, that type of regulatory action can cost somewhere between £0.5 million and £2 million of unbudgeted spend. And that doesn't include anything for the lost revenue during that period as well. So the consequences are very, very high. So from our research, there's a number of main reasons for a drug shortage, and I've given some idea of the respondents of previous surveys, and I'm going to just put in front of you now a poll for you to vote on which of the 5 of these are, in your experience, the most common reason for drug shortages. So are they going to be around environmental conditions, GMP concerns, global capacity, cost pressures, whatever it may be? So I'm going to ask you to just vote on your poll to the right of your screen, and then we'll share that with you, and you can see the response from the people that have dialed in. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to read those 5 particular options and ask you to vote for what you see as the most common. And I should say as well, I'm going to share a recording of this webinar, the results of the poll, and some other links, other useful links with you after the webinar. So we're starting to get some votes coming in now, which is great. Thank you for that. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds or so to add your votes. And there's quite a broad, almost equal spread across legacy issues with plant not being available, maybe interrupted supply due to regulatory action, and we'll come on to that in some detail in a minute. GMP issues that have led to a loss of trust, which often is involved with either regulatory action or action from the contract giver. Or sometimes it can just be too expensive, too long, too painful to look for regulatory approval of a new supplier across all of your markets. So thank you very much for that. There was a good spread between the 4, and we'll make sure that we share those with you. So if I come out of the poll and move on, thank you for that. So I wanted to share this case study with you fairly briefly as well. Obviously, one of the biggest drug shortages we've had in recent times was around nitrosamine. And NSF have been a leader in the thinking of how to deal with this particular issue, this technical issue. And I wanted to draw your attention to the NSF webinar done by Turlock O'Croydon. I've got the link there for you. And of course, as many of you will probably know, there were some significant drug shortages around some major therapies, including the sartans, valsartan, losartan, and most recently with ranitidine. So this was caused by a realization that those products had some very small but very significant contamination of nitrosamine within their formulations. So in response to this, the FDA embarked on 23 inspections of those manufacturers over the last couple of years, and way over half of those inspections led to official action indicated, which is regulatory censure. So over half of those suppliers of products had significant, critical, major, or recurring issues that were related to this particular cause. Just because of the nature of the location of the suppliers, many of those manufacturers were in India, but probably more important for this webinar, when the FDA takes samples of the cardiovascular products that we spoke about over the last 3 years, we've noticed that there's been a 12-fold increase in the number of non-compliant samples tested. So a phenomenal increase in the number of out-specification results identified by FDA when sampling products that are on the market. So a very significant issue. So what about the regulatory focus? Well, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, really led the way in 2016 and have some specific guidance on this. But the formation of the FDA Drug Shortage Task Force in 2018 led to some very interesting references that I thought I'd share with you here. The first one is that the Drug Shortage Task Force now reports annually to Congress on the drug shortages that are affecting the USA and is recommending a variety of mitigations. It's also working to identify those products and supply chains and companies that appear to have the highest risk of drug shortage so that they can focus their programs on those companies. They've also embarked and increased their education program, their support and communication with the industry through the 2019 Quality Symposium, more than 2,200 people attending. And I'd also refer you to their drug shortages report from 2019, which I think is extremely interesting in the way that the FDA are engaging with us on this particular issue. And right up to date for FY 2020, there is a legislative proposal in the US to make a legal requirement for license holders to perform a periodic risk assessment and to actually detail the mitigation activities that are there to reduce the risk of repeated supply chain issues. So, what other scientific or technical or GMP related initiatives is the FDA working on just now? Well, the first one is NIPP. And the idea behind this is that given that the products tend to be sterile generics, high volume, low margin products that are in short supply, the agency is going to change the way it does inspections of those types of facilities to try and make those inspections more insightful, more consistent, and get a lot more detail from those inspections and really focus on what could cause a drug shortage in these areas. They're also looking to be a lot more proactive with potential suppliers in the future using the Site Engagement Program, SEP. So this was about working with firms ahead of license application to look at quality issues right from the start, to try and help companies become a lot more proactive in fixing supply issues from the get-go, ultimately wanting to start on the right foot. They're also working heavily with an established conditions working group. So this group is all about making sure that your change control system works well, that you assess change, you assess the risk of change, and that ultimately the agency is kept fully informed of any post-approval change that you're considering, and trying to build clarity and efficiency in the process, trying to make it faster, but also more effective. Thinking about the legacy facilities that we have around the world seeking to get to the 2020 design attributes that are expected, the Emerging Technology Program was put together to really help those companies understand how to adopt some of those new technologies or new approaches in the design of their facilities or design of their test methods, and get those discussions made ahead of the regulatory filings so that you can actually, again, make sure that the best possible technology is being used for your new filings. And a good example of that is the approval recently of the first continuous processing facility for API. And of course, no surprises there. There is a working group for the concerns around nitrosamines. So ultimately, how is this going to affect you in pharmaceutical operations? Well, let's look at maybe 6 ways that this could affect your regulatory inspection. The first thing is that there's going to be a lot more focus on the way you do supplier risk management and the way you provide information and the amount of rigor and documentation that you put into your initial risk assessment and your initial competency and proficiency assessment of your supplier. Of course, even though that supplier may be in place and established, there's going to be a lot more discussion during your inspection on how you do that periodically. How do you revisit? How do you provide oversight, not just to your tier 1 suppliers, but also to their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers? That is effectively covering 3 tiers of supply chain. So there's going to be a lot more interest in how you maintain that full supply chain and across the full supply chain map. So approval and oversight is going to be very, very important, a big issue for the next few years. There's also going to be a lot more rigor and interest in the way you do business continuity planning. And this may be from everything from drug shortages to outage of IT systems, or indeed any type of system or facility, utility or equipment that could lead to a product shortage. So your process of preventing issues, of recovering when issues occur, your contingency planning, how you manage either single sources or dual sources, and how you maintain a degree of emergency stock or work in progress is going to be of much, much more interest than it has been previously by the agency. Of course, we're also seeing that staff turnover and the abilities and proficiency and experience of key or critical position holders is also leading to some drug shortages in some key parts of the world. So there's going to be a lot more interest in training, education, the setting of culture, and also fixing issues by those critical position holders. Of course, they're going to be very interested in your legacy plant, not just how you maintain it, how you do your planned preventive maintenance, but how did you derive the frequency of that planned preventive maintenance? How do you know that your equipment is working correctly 24/7? Now, are you adopting the real-time condition monitoring that are expected? And obviously measuring and monitoring your plant availability. And fundamentally, do you have a CapEx plan to continually maintain, improve, or upgrade your facilities to avoid those types of failure modes that lead to drug shortage? Ultimately, of course, they're always going to be interested in your quality system, but they talk a lot more now about being beyond compliance, actually having a mature quality system that involves excellent use of ICHQ9 and a really wide involvement from maybe some non-typical department heads or critical position holders. You know, you expect this from production, from QA, from technical support, QC, but they're really going to expect much more input from procurement, logistics, engineering, and technical services. And fundamentally, of course, a key area here is materials management. And I think one of the things that they're going to review in a lot more detail is the prevalence of non-right first time. So every time you have a product or a process that is terminated or needs reworking or reprocessing or reinspection, or obviously leading to rejected batches, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on what caused that, what effect it had on the supply chain, and whether it could have been prevented. So I'm going to ask you just to feedback to me again here, after listening to this and with your own experience, do you think over the next 5 years, drug shortages are going to improve, get worse, or stay the same? So I'll ask you to just pull up your control panel on the right there and vote for one of those 3 options, please. Improve, get worse, or stay the same. And let's see what we get here. Great, we're starting to see the votes coming in. This is always one of the most exciting parts of the webinar for me, to see your interaction and to see your perceptions on what's happening. So I'm going to give you another 10 or 15 seconds to get your vote in. And interestingly enough, I think about 50% of us will think it will get worse. Maybe partly to do with COVID, maybe partly to do with the fact that there is a lead time for these programs to improve. At least a quarter of you think it will stay the same, and a quarter of you are optimistically thinking it will improve as well. So ultimately, I suppose that's telling me that nearly 3/4 of us think it'll either stay the same or get worse, at least in the short term. So that's pretty serious, isn't it? So I'm going to leave you really with this thought from John Ruskin from 1863. I think he was ahead of his game here. So it's unwise to pay too much, but it's much worse to pay too little. When you pay too much, you lose a little bit of money, that's all. When you pay too little, sometimes you lose everything because the thing you bought was incapable of doing the thing you bought it to do. The common law of business balance prohibits you from paying a little and getting a lot. It just can't be done. And if you always deal with the lowest bidder, it's just as well to add something for the risk that you run. And if you do that, if you do add something for that risk, you'll have enough to pay for something better. Now, a little story behind this was that I went on great expense on holiday to do some fly fishing on the Alaskan border about 5 years ago. And I put a lot of preparation into it, and I knew that I had a very good chance of catching some fantastic salmon, some personal bests. And I knew that if I bought cheap fishing gear, it would let me down. So I made very sure that I bought the very best gear that I could, so that I reduced the risk of it letting me down and causing availability issues. So I needed to maximize my time on the river, and I could only do that by investing in what was right and well designed with as few failure modes as possible, rather than going for something that was cheap. So hopefully that was of interest to you. I know many of you are already using our NSF Farmer app. You can contact me through the app if you wish. We have an Ask an Expert tab within that app, and all of our resources and information and updates are always updated immediately into the NSF app. So I would recommend that to you as well. I hope you've really enjoyed the webinar. Obviously, I will grab the information from the polls. I will collect the recording, and we'll send that information to you straight after the webinar, within probably 24 hours or so. So hopefully you enjoyed that. It's good to be in contact, and thank you very much for listening.